poor at first because they were early immigrants, okay, but they weren't dipshits, and so as a result, they weren't poor for very long, right? That is, the poverty doesn't cause the dipshittery. Like, we have these populations that came in early on that were poor, but just because they were poor didn't mean they engaged in those activities. They did not. You look at Korean immigrants, you know, they don't engage in that kind of behavior, okay? That kind of behavior is not, it's not part of being poor. It's not an inherent part of being poor, right? People who engage in those behavior become poor. That's all. Okay. Then he says, blacks do poorly in the school curriculum because the schools don't teach Afrocentric fairy tales about the great sub-Saharan African civilizations. Okay, well, this is irrelevant because as shown previously, blacks have higher intellectual self-esteem than whites. But this guy, Mojosideburns, whatever, he keeps repeating the mantra that you can't prove anything until you level the playing field. Well, my position is that the playing field is level right now, and that the differences in outcomes are almost entirely a result of differences in innate ability, and I believe I made that case reasonably well in this video. Moreover, your evidence that the playing field is not level today is just history and pointing out that poor people engage in dipshit behavior. And, you know, and of course you haven't made any causal connection between historical legal discrimination or legal disadvantages. You haven't made any causal link between that history and today. And given how, you know, trivial the environmental effects are proven when you actually closely scrutinize them, it's unbelievable that prior discrimination would explain much of anything. Finally, just remember that your position, which is the belief that the races are innately, equally innately intelligent, is both an impossible position, it's an impossible thing to exist, and it's a very recent belief. Okay, it's impossible because, you know, we have these races, and these races differ in average in every single part of the body, right? Skin, muscles, heart, blood type distribution, adiposity, blood pressure, and brain size and head size. Okay, white European and North Asian women have wider hips than black African women, and that's to accommodate the larger heads of their babies. And in fact, North Asian women are sometimes bow-legged. Right? There's a problem with Asian women being bow-legged because of the very large heads of North Asian babies. Blacks also tend to reach puberty earlier than whites, and whites tend to reach puberty earlier than North Asians. And in general, this is a generalization. So despite all these differences, we are to assume that these races ended up with the same average brain function, right? Despite having different average-sized brains in terms of, you know, differences in sizes. Now, I'm not saying here that bigger brains are necessarily better, okay, but, you know, bigger brains are different, okay? Why would you assume that these brains ended up with the same average function? Now, this is shown to be an even more stupid belief when we recognize that certainly some individuals are innately more intelligent than others, right? We all know that there are some people who we know, we can tell, and by their performance, it's revealed that they are innately more intelligent, right? Sometimes this, and this innate intelligence does tend to generalize, okay? Now, people will specify, though some people will be math whizzes, but people who are like really good at math tend to also be pretty good at spelling, or pretty good at writing and English and literature and stuff. Now, they do specialize, but there is also a general intelligence factor. And so, if individuals can be innately more intelligent than each other, why do we assume that groups of individuals, which we categorize as races, have to be equal on average, when individuals we know are not equal innately? Okay, that's the strange split that people have. The truth is that people simply didn't think this through. Okay, that's why they think this, because they're not really thinking about it. They were told this as gospel as young children before they could evaluate it, which brings me to my next point, that the idea of racial equality is a product of the current historical period. Okay, and the current historical period is characterized by a religious belief in democracy, the unquestioning belief that a state is necessary to have law, and the belief that the races of man are innately equally intelligent on average. And this actually ties in with the Frankfurt School in cultural Marxism. Just a quick explanation. In the 1800s, the German Historical School was the dominant school of economics in Germany, and they held that economic laws were culture-specific. That is, that the classical school of Smith and Ricardo did make accurate predictions and inferences, but that their laws really only applied to the populations that they studied, and that these economic laws were not universal. Right? Marx took this idea of economic relativism and went on to advocate communism. But communism, as we all know, has an obvious incentive problem. Why should any individual work if his work has such a tiny impact on how much he gets paid? Well, Marx believed that man was a blank slate, and so his fundamental nature could be changed through the right conditioning, and man will simply want to work despite not getting any more pay from working hard. And people generally refer to this as the new socialist man that would come from this conditioning, although Marx himself never used the term new socialist man. During World War I, the Marxists believed that the European workers would rally to their classes and rise up against the capitalists and all this bullshit. But as we know, the workers ended up rallying around the nations, their flag and linguistic groups. Only in Russia did communism win out against the czars. But even there, even in Russia, the Bolsheviks actually lost the only elections they held, and I believe the monarchists actually won the first election. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's what happened. Anyway, the Bolsheviks didn't win the first election, and so Lenin ended up just scrapping elections because he didn't want his party to be losing, so he just, dumped democracy when it didn't work for him. And Russia, what a lot of people don't realize, Russia was still highly nationalistic under communism, so much so that Stalin, realizing this, changed the program from an international global workers' revolution to socialism in one country. Right? And that was the idea in order to appeal to the nationalism of the Russians. And even in the USSR, it wasn't really communism. It was just heavy-handed central planning. Right? It's just what we have in the USA to a greater degree. Now, they actually tried true communism in the USSR in the 1920s during the Civil War, and it failed. It failed so bad that Lenin tried to cover it up by calling it war communism and saying that it was only a policy for wartime. But basically, it was communism, and it was nightmare. And it was a nightmare. And he ended up calling it war communism in order to try to say, well, that's not real communism. That's not what we're going towards. The higher-ups ended up believing that, well, the initial attempt to impose pure communism right away, it failed, obviously. But that's fine because we haven't done the conditioning program yet. So we'll do the conditioning program, and then in, say, 50 to 100 years, we can then try true communism again. And we won't call it war communism when we do it that time. Of course, that ended up not happening. No conditioning worked. Human nature is not that malleable. Anyway, the failure was so glaring, and we're talking about the 1920s here. The failure was so glaring of communism that a group of Marxists decided that they needed to push for a stronger campaign to destroy that fiber of nationalism, tradition, racial identity, and, capitalist ethics of like thrift, responsibility, and investment. They had to destroy all of these things, as these were all impediments to people embracing communism. And they believed that this all could be done because they held to the dogmatic religious belief in the blank slate. Okay. So, and the idea of the cultural Marxists is that once the social fiber was destroyed, right, the tradition, racial identity, nationalism, and capitalist ethics, once these are all destroyed and no longer held by anyone, then they could advance communism. And the truth is they've already done so quite a bit. They've completely destroyed racial identity, completely demonized it. They're trying to tie, and now what they're trying to do is people are not. This is not a completely coherent plan. It's not like some puppet master, but it's what people are doing. They're trying to tie racial identity with tradition, right? They've already destroyed racial identity, and so now what they're trying to do is they're trying to link everything on to this point that they've already destroyed. They're trying to link capitalist ethics to racism. They're trying to link traditional values, traditional family values, and social values to racism, and they're trying to link nationalism to racism. So, anyway. Now, democracy is just a form of communism. Bold claim, you say? Well, not at all. Think about it. The state can, if it really wants to, take away everything that you have, right? There can be a vote to overturn any supposed legal limit you think exists, right? Any constitutional barrier can be voted away. It can, right? Constitution can be amended. All the barriers can be voted away. This means that the state ultimately owns everything in the U.S. There is no private property in the U.S. in the true sense of private property. Okay, the very notion that they can vote to tax part of your property, infers that they already own it and that they can decide on how much to take. And the state is, of course, controlled by the majority, right, in the democratic system. And through the state, the general population owns everything in common, which is to say democracy is communism, which is to say the U.S. is a communist state. Okay, now I know it sounds like a kooky belief, and I know that your instinct is to dismiss this, but if you follow the reasoning, it's very simple and it's very obvious. Anyway, that's where your belief in racial equality comes from. It's not scientific, it's political. Its roots are in Marxism, and it's part of a larger general plan that many people take part in, including you, in your very small way. Most unwittingly, most have no idea what they're doing. They just think that they're advocating liberalism, that they're progressives, they're on the cutting edge of societal evolution, or whatever bullshit. But basically, they're pawns for this cultural Marxist scheme. They're idiots, right? And they're basically advancing soft communism worldwide. One last point I would like to make is a more philosophical point, and that is that anyone can choose to have kids, okay? It is not an accomplishment to have kids, and people don't just blip into existence, right? There's no stork that comes from some far-off land that just delivers babies, okay? Let's say one family chooses to have 2 kids, okay? And another family chooses to have 10, okay? That is their choice. And you may say, well, they were accidents. Well, it is your choice to have sex, okay? We evolved to have sex in order to have kids. When you have sex, you are taking the risk of having a kid. So you have 10 kids, that was your choice. You chose to have sex, and or you chose to have a kid. Okay, now, let's say that the 2 kids from the small family grow up wealthy, and that the 10 kids from the large family grow up to be poor, right? Is it now the duty of the children of the small family, those 2 kids, to pay to support the children of the large family, those 10 kids, right? Should they have to pay because those people chose to have more kids than they could support? That's exactly what you're advocating. And that's exactly what anyone is advocating whenever they support welfarism or any of these systematic theft schemes. Okay, I think I'll end that there. I hope you can recognize that you are not at the end of history, okay, that you are in fact living in the age of democracy, and your core beliefs reflect that, and the core beliefs that you hold are not guaranteed truths.